Have you ever felt so strongly about something that shouting just wasn't enough? That to really make people listen, you had to do the opposite? You had to be silent. It's a strange thought, isn't it? We think of protest as loud. Signs, chants, angry voices. But one of the most powerful moments in the fight for women's right to vote in America wasn't a roar. It was a quiet, determined march. The date is March 3, 1913. The city is Washington, D.C. In just one day, a new president, Woodrow Wilson, will be inaugurated. The city is buzzing, filled with people, flags, and anticipation. But when President-elect Wilson arrives at the train station that afternoon, he's surprised. The crowds he expected to see lining the streets to welcome him, they aren't there. He asks, "Where are the people?" And an aide tells him, they're over on Pennsylvania Avenue, watching the Women's Suffrage Parade. This parade wasn't just a sideshow. It was a bold, brilliant move. A silent spectacle designed to steal the spotlight and announce to the entire country that the fight for the vote had changed. The mind behind this was a young woman named Alice Paul. She was only 28 years old, but she was a force of nature. She had spent time in England with the more radical suffragettes there. She had been arrested, gone on hunger strikes. She had learned that quiet patience wasn't always enough. Sometimes you had to be dramatic. You had to create a scene the world couldn't ignore. When she came back to America, she found the movement here had grown a little too comfortable, a little too slow. She wanted to inject it with a new energy. So she proposed this grand procession, right before the new president took office. It was a direct challenge, a message that said, "You cannot and you will not ignore us anymore." Organizing it was a monumental task. They had very little money and only a few months. But women from all over the country answered the call. They sewed banners, built elaborate floats, and practiced their marching. Alice Paul's vision was for something beautiful and orderly. She wanted to show the world that women were not the hysterical, emotional creatures they were often portrayed as. They were intelligent, organized, and worthy of a voice in their own government. The plan was for a stunning display. At the very front, a lawyer and activist named Inez Milholland would ride a brilliant white horse, dressed like a herald in a white cape. Behind her, a huge banner with the words that would become the movement's rallying cry: "We demand an amendment to the Constitution of the United States enfranchising the women of this country." They organized the marchers into groups. There were sections for librarians, teachers, factory workers, mothers, and artists. Women from different countries marched together to show international support. It was a living, breathing display of who a woman could be. More than a wife, more than a mother, a citizen. One of the most difficult decisions was about race. Organizers, fearing they would lose the support of Southern white women, asked the black suffragists, including the famous journalist Ida B. Wells, to march in a segregated section at the back. It's a painful part of the story, a reminder that even in a fight for justice, there can be injustice. But Ida B. Wells refused. She waited on the sidelines, and when the parade began, she simply stepped out from the crowd and joined the delegation from her home state of Illinois, marching right alongside her white colleagues. An act of quiet, powerful defiance within another. So, the moment arrives. The afternoon of March 3rd. 5,000 women, maybe more, line up. Inez Milholland sits atop her white horse, a striking, almost mythical figure. The floats are in place. The brilliant purple, white, and gold banners of the movement ripple in the cold air. They begin to move down Pennsylvania Avenue. At first, it's just as they planned. It's a spectacle. The crowds are huge, but for a little while, they are just watching. The silence of the marchers, their dignified expressions, their beautiful banners, it's captivating. You can almost feel the hope in the air. This was their moment. But then the mood begins to change. The crowd, made up of mostly men in town for the inauguration, starts to press in. The police, who were supposed to keep the route clear, do almost nothing. They just stand and watch. The path for the marchers narrows until it's barely a single file line. The silence of the women is met with jeers and insults. Vile things are shouted at them. They are called names. They are told to go home, to get back to the kitchen. And then it gets physical. Men start grabbing at their banners, tearing them from their hands. They trip them. They spit on them. They throw lit cigars at them. One of the floats, a beautiful construction of hope, is swarmed and nearly torn apart. Imagine the feeling, to have planned something so beautiful, so peaceful, and to be met with such ugliness. To be surrounded by a hateful, screaming mob with no one to help you. The women held onto each other. They tried to keep their composure, to keep moving forward, their faces set with determination. But inside, they must have been terrified. They were doctors, lawyers, mothers, daughters, and they were being attacked for simply asking for a voice. The parade completely stalled. It became a riot. Women were knocked down, their clothes torn. Over 100 of them had to be taken to the hospital. The beautiful procession, the silent, powerful statement, had been broken by mob violence. On the surface, it looked like a complete disaster. A failure. But Alice Paul knew better. She understood the power of the press. The next day, the headlines weren't about Woodrow Wilson's arrival. They were about the riot, about peaceful women being brutally attacked in the nation's capital while the police stood by. The story spread like wildfire, and with it came a wave of sympathy and outrage. People who had never really thought much about women's suffrage were suddenly paying attention. They were shocked by the violence. The march may have failed to reach its destination, but it had succeeded in its true purpose. It had made suffrage a national emergency. It forced a congressional inquiry into the failure of the police to protect the marchers. It put President Wilson in a corner. He could no longer pretend this was a minor issue. The quiet march had created the loudest noise imaginable. This one event changed the momentum of the entire movement in America. It sparked a new, more confrontational era that would include the silent sentinels who protested outside the White House for months on end, leading to more arrests and more headlines. It took 7 more years of struggle, of protest, of sacrifice, but in 1920, the 19th Amendment was finally ratified, granting women the right to vote. When we look back at that day in 1913, it's easy to see the chaos and the violence. But what we should really see is the courage. The courage to plan something bold. The courage of Ida B. Wells to demand her rightful place. The courage of 5,000 women to face down a mob, not with fists, but with dignity. They showed the world that a silent, determined presence can be more powerful than any shout, and that the fight for what is right is never, ever a failure.